Picture the scene. A single scream slices through the icy night air, echoing down the stone corridors of Bletsoe Castle. It is the winter of 1457, a season when the wind howls like a beast through the battlements and snow lies heavy across the English countryside. But inside those thick walls, another storm is raging, not of weather, but of flesh, blood, and destiny. In a dimly lit chamber, the air stinks of sweat, herbs, and burning tallow. 13-year-old Lady Margaret Beaufort clutches the blood-soaked sheets beneath her with hands that tremble like leaves in a storm. Her small body convulses, racked by waves of agony no child should ever endure. Her hair, dark and drenched with sweat, clings to her pale face as she bites down to stifle a cry, only to scream again when the next contraction rips through her like fire. Around her, the midwives whisper hurried prayers in Latin, their faces caught between duty and terror. Candles flicker, their light bending across the rough stone walls, throwing shadows that look like specters dancing in mockery. One midwife wipes Margaret's brow, another arranges clean linens, already stained crimson before they can be used. They are seasoned women who have delivered countless babies, yet even they can see the truth. This girl is too young, her hips are too narrow, her body too frail, the child inside her is too large, and the night may well claim both mother and child. Outside the chamber, the wind howls against the towers, rattling the shutters. Snow falls silently on Bedfordshire, covering the frozen earth in white stillness. But inside this room, the silence is shattered again and again by Margaret's screams, the sound of a child forced to become a mother. The women present know what is at stake. This is no ordinary birth. This is the heir of Edmund Tudor, half-brother to King Henry VI. The child struggling to enter this world is no common boy. He is a prince of blood, a future claimant to the throne of England. The irony twists like a knife. A dynasty that will shape the course of history is being born not in triumph, but in blood, suffering, and near death. Margaret grips the sheets harder as her voice breaks into sobs. She is still more child than woman, her body unfinished, her bones not yet hardened by age. And yet tonight she is caught in a battle that could kill her. For every contraction, every scream is not just pain, but a gamble with death itself. The midwives exchanged looks heavy with unspoken truth. They have seen young girls torn apart by childbirth before. They know how this ends, and it rarely ends well. But destiny is merciless. The world beyond these walls does not care if Margaret lives or dies. The wars of the roses are tearing England apart, bloodlines turned into weapons, marriages transformed into politics. And here in this chamber, a pawn in that game is being sacrificed to bring forth a king. And then it happens. A cry, thin, ragged, but alive. The sound of an infant fills the chamber, cutting through the suffocating dread like light through darkness. The midwives lift a small, pale child, bloodied but breathing, and in that instant, history shifts. This boy, Henry Tudor, will grow to seize the crown, end the Wars of the Roses, and found the Tudor dynasty. But no one in that moment sees triumph. They see only a girl, barely conscious, her body torn and bleeding, her spirit clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. Margaret's half-lidded eyes flicker open just long enough to glimpse the child laid briefly against her chest before he is carried away to be cleaned. It is a cruel beginning, a king born in agony, and a mother left broken. The Tudor dynasty does not begin with glory. It begins with the screams of a child who should have been playing in castle gardens, not dying in a birthing bed.
To understand why a 13-year-old girl was sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition, we need to step back. Margaret Beaufort was no ordinary child. She was born in May of 1443 in the halls of Bletsoe Castle, carrying in her veins the blood of kings. She was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, the mighty Duke of Lancaster, son of Edward III of England. Her bloodline tied her directly to the crown, and in the brutal politics of the 15th century, that was both a blessing and a curse. Her father was John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, a man once entrusted with the command of England's armies in France during the closing years of the 100 Years' War. He was meant to be a savior of the English cause, but instead, he became its broken casualty. John returned from France in 1444 a ruined man. He had watched as English territories, hard won by the legendary Henry V, slip away one by one until defeat hung over him like a funeral shroud. His soldiers whispered of betrayal, of incompetence, of disgrace, and the weight of that failure crushed him. Those who saw him after his return remembered a hollow-eyed shadow of the man he had once been. He ate little, spoke less, and wandered the halls as though haunted by ghosts only he could see. On May 27, 1444, he was found dead in his chambers. The official report called it fever, but the whispers told a darker tale. Some said despair drove him to his own sword. Others said poison, the ever-present companion of the noble class, had claimed him. In truth, it may have been both, failure as the poison, shame as the blade. Whatever the cause, Margaret was left fatherless before she was 2 years old. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, was no stranger to survival. Widowed now, she understood the cruel arithmetic of noble life. Her daughter's value lay not in her innocence, but in the alliances she could seal. Little Margaret, barely able to walk, became a pawn in a chess game played by the most powerful families in England. At the age of 6, Margaret was already betrothed to John de la Pole, heir to the Duke of Suffolk. To outsiders, it was a brilliant match, 2 powerful families bound together. But in England, power was as fleeting as the wind. Suffolk himself fell from grace in 1450, accused of treason, corruption, and betrayal. As he attempted to flee across the Channel, he was dragged from his ship and executed in one of the gruesome deaths of the age. His head was hacked off with a rusty sword, requiring multiple savage blows before the job was done. His fall destroyed the betrothal, leaving Margaret's future, once again, uncertain. But her betrothal failed. Her bloodline did not. The Beaufort name was both a weapon and a curse. It marked her as a descendant of Edward III, but through an illegitimate branch later legitimized by royal decree. This stain meant that Margaret would forever live in a liminal space, close enough to the throne to matter, but vulnerable enough to be sacrificed. She grew up in Bletsoe Castle's gardens and halls, but she did not grow up free. Every game she played, every lesson she learned, every whisper from her mother reminded her that her future was not her own. She would be married off, her body traded like coin in the greater game of survival. And so, even as a child, Margaret began to understand a cruel truth. Her life was not hers. It belonged to the dynasty she carried in her veins, a bloodline powerful enough to crown kings or to destroy her.
By the age of 12, Margaret's fate was sealed. She was still a child, her body slight, her mind shaped more by prayers than politics, yet in the eyes of England's nobility, she was ready. Ready not for games or learning, but for marriage. Her groom was Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. He was in his mid-20s, a seasoned man, hardened by the tides of war and politics. He was also the half-brother of King Henry VI, which made him a valuable ally in the dangerous struggle for control of the kingdom. For Edmund, marriage to Margaret was not romance, it was strategy. The wedding took place in 1455 at her childhood home of Bletsoe Castle. The great hall was draped with banners, its stone walls echoing with the solemn chants of priests as the vows were spoken. Margaret stood before the altar in a gown that made her look every bit the noble bride, though the truth was that, beneath the silks, she was still more girl than woman. Edmund Tudor claimed her that night. There was no waiting for maturity, no consideration for her age or frailty. In the world of dynastic ambition, noble girls were treated as broodmares, their value measured by the heirs they could produce. The marriage was consummated immediately. For Margaret, it was not the beginning of wedded bliss, but a trauma that carved scars into her body and her soul. She never spoke of that night in later life, not once, but the silence itself was louder than words. Historians can only imagine the horror of a 12-year-old girl thrust into a role meant for women twice her age. Her body, still developing, was forced into submission. The consequences would be permanent. Within months, the inevitable happened. Margaret's belly began to swell. Whispers filled the halls, half in awe, half in fear. A child was coming, the continuation of the Tudor line, perhaps even a future king. But to those closest to her, there was dread. For Margaret was not ready. Her hips were narrow, her bones unfinished, her strength untested. Pregnancy at such an age was a death sentence more often than not. And then, fate struck another blow. In the autumn of 1456, while Margaret carried his child, Edmund Tudor was captured during the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. Imprisoned at Carmarthen Castle in Wales, he did not last long. Whether he died of plague, neglect, or a dagger in the dark, no one could say for certain. Some chroniclers believe disease took him swiftly. Others whispered that betrayal had silenced him. But the result was the same. Edmund was dead before he ever saw his child. When the news reached Margaret, she was barely 13 years old, a widow, a child, pregnant and alone in a kingdom spiraling into civil war. Her future and the future of her unborn son now hung by a thread.
The winter of 1456 was brutal. Snow and ice smothered the Welsh landscape, rivers froze, and roads turned into treacherous mud traps. Yet through this merciless season, a child widow, barely 13 years old, was forced to travel. Margaret Beaufort, already swollen with pregnancy, was carried in a litter from place to place, her fragile body jolted and battered with every frozen rut, every uneven stone. Her destination was Pembroke Castle, the stronghold of Jasper Tudor, her late husband's brother. A fortress carved into cliffs overlooking the sea, Pembroke was a place of safety in theory, but in reality, it was a grim and drafty prison. The Atlantic winds howled through its towers, rattling shutters, forcing icy air into every chamber. Fires burned night and day, devouring wood in desperate attempts to hold back the cold, but even then, ice formed on the inside of the windows. Margaret's chamber was draped with heavy tapestries, the floor lined with rushes, herbs scattered to mask the stink of illness and fear. Midwives whispered prayers as they prepared linens, knives, and relics. They knew what was coming. They had seen it before. A girl giving birth when her body was not yet ready. Nature itself was being defied. When her labor began in January 1457, Margaret was walking slowly along the battlements for exercise. The first pain struck her like a blade, twisting deep in her abdomen. She doubled over against the icy stone wall, gasping, clutching her belly as her attendants rushed to her side. By the time they carried her to her bed, the contractions had already begun to tear through her with merciless force. For hours, then through the night, Margaret screamed. Her cries echoed off the stone walls of Pembroke like the wails of a ghost. The midwives moved with grim efficiency, but behind their calm eyes was fear. This was a child in labor, her hips too narrow, her body still growing. They could already see that the baby was large, badly positioned. The chances of survival were slim. The room reeked of burning herbs, lavender for calm,
rosemary for strength, sage for protection. But no incense could mask the blood. The sheets beneath Margaret were soaked crimson, her small hands clawing at the fabric as if she could hold on to life itself. The physician, Master Louis of Caerleon, stood nearby, his face carved with worry. He had delivered children to noblewomen and peasants alike, but never had he seen a case so dire. He whispered to Jasper Tudor in the corner. "Her hips are too narrow. The child is badly turned. She will not last long if this continues." But there was no choice. To cut the baby free would mean Margaret's certain death. To wait meant the risk of both mother and child perishing. So they gambled with time. 18 hours passed. Margaret's screams turned hoarse, then broke into guttural moans, the sound of a body shattering under its own burden. Her voice gave out, leaving only the raw animal gasps of suffering. Sweat and blood drenched her, her face pale as parchment, her lips trembling with whispered prayers. "Holy Mother, save me." The midwives tried everything. They turned her this way and that, massaged her swollen belly, pressed against her hips, murmured encouragement as her strength drained away. Their knives and hooks lay nearby, ready if desperate measures became necessary. For a time, it seemed death was already in the room, waiting in the corner. Then, a final push, a tearing that nearly broke her, and at last, after almost a full day of agony, the chamber fell into a terrible silence. A pale infant, slick with blood, lay limp in the midwife's arms. For a moment, no one dared breathe. Then, a cry, thin, weak, but alive. The wail of a newborn filled the room, cutting through the silence like a spark in darkness. Henry Tudor had been born. The midwives rushed him to the fire, wrapping him in linen, warming his tiny body, whispering blessings. Margaret, half-conscious, her body mangled and torn, heard the sound of her son's first cry. Through a haze of pain, she tried to lift her arms, but they would not obey. For a brief instant, they placed him against her chest, his small warmth pressing against her broken body. She stared at his face, memorizing every detail, before he was carried away again. But the price was severe. Margaret's body was ruined by the ordeal. Torn flesh, internal injuries, blood loss so great it nearly ended her life. The physician whispered to Jasper Tudor that she would likely never bear another child. This one birth had broken her forever. For weeks afterwards, Margaret lingered between life and death, fevered and trembling. She was nursed back by the tireless care of Dame Gwen, the head midwife, who spooned broth into her cracked lips and prayed over her through the night. Somehow, miraculously, the girl survived. But she was changed, permanently scarred, permanently barren. A child forced to give life, and in doing so, condemned never to do so again. And so it was that England's future king entered the world, not with celebration, but with blood, screams, and the near death of his mother. The dynasty that would reshape the world began in the agony of a girl who should never have been there in the first place.
For weeks after the birth, Margaret hovered between life and death. Her chamber at Pembroke Castle smelled of fever and smoke, herbs and sweat. The physician bled her to balance her humors, spooned bitter concoctions into her mouth, and prayed his hands would not fail. Dame Gwen, the midwife, refused to leave her side. Day after day, she pressed broth to Margaret's cracked lips, wiped sweat from her brow, and whispered comfort as the child mother drifted in and out of delirium. Her body was wrecked. The tearing from labor had left wounds that would never fully heal. She was so young, her bones still forming, her pelvis not yet hardened, and the strain had permanently scarred her. The physician admitted to Jasper Tudor in a low, grave voice,
She will never bear another child. This birth has broken her. At 13, Margaret Beaufort was already a widow, already a mother, already barren. Most girls would have been destroyed by such a fate, but Margaret was not most girls. Something changed in her during those long weeks of recovery. Her body had been shattered, yes, but her will, instead of breaking, seemed to harden like iron. She threw herself into religion with a fervor that unsettled even the priests around her. Hours were spent on her knees in the castle chapel whispering prayers until her skin split and bled. She fasted, scourged herself, and memorized long passages of Latin scripture. To her, survival had not been luck, it was divine purpose. God had spared her for a reason, and that reason, she believed, was her son. If her body could no longer serve the dynasty, then her mind would. She turned to learning with a hunger that astonished those around her. Jasper Tudor and Father Meredith, the Welsh priest at Pembroke, began to guide her. From Jasper, she absorbed the harsh lessons of politics, how alliances shifted like sand, how men lied with smiles, how wars were born from whispers. From Father Meredith, she learned that faith and action must walk together, that prayer without strategy was weakness, and strategy without God was dangerous pride. Margaret's recovery was not only physical but intellectual. The girl who had once been a pawn in others' games began to study the board for herself. She learned to watch faces at court, to catch the meaning behind careful words, to sense the hidden daggers in alliances. She discovered that silence could be more powerful than speech, that patience, properly wielded, could be a weapon sharper than steel. But beneath all this was her son, Henry Tudor. Every decision, every prayer, every whispered calculation now revolved around him. He was not just her child. He was her mission, her proof that the suffering she endured had meaning. She could not bear another child, but she could shape this one into a king. Margaret's devotion to Henry bordered on obsession. She was still only a teenager, barely past childhood, yet she carried herself with the gravity of a woman twice her age. Those who met her after her recovery spoke of her piercing gaze, her quiet authority, the strange mixture of fragility and unyielding will that clung to her like a second skin. The trauma of her body had forged something far more dangerous than anyone expected. A girl who had suffered the worst and survived, and who now believed she was chosen by God to see her son crowned. The broken child was gone. In her place stood a woman with iron in her soul.
England was bleeding. By the mid-1450s, the kingdom had descended into chaos. Two roses, the red of Lancaster and the white of York, had become the banners of civil war. Castles burned, nobles plotted, and every family was forced to choose a side. Margaret, still only a teenager, was caught in the middle of it all. She had given birth to Henry Tudor, a child with Lancastrian blood, and that alone made her a target. For the Yorkists, he was a threat. For the Lancastrians, he was a beacon of hope. For Margaret, he was everything, and keeping him alive meant she had to play a game far deadlier than any battlefield. Her survival came in the form of another marriage. In 1458, barely a year after she had nearly died in childbirth, Margaret was wed to Sir Henry Stafford, the younger son of the powerful Duke of Buckingham. The marriage was not born of love or passion. It was a transaction, a political arrangement designed to give Margaret protection and stability in a world tearing itself apart. The wedding was quiet, a pale shadow compared to her grand match with Edmund Tudor. She was still weak, her body scarred, her spirit heavy with grief. Stafford, pragmatic and cautious, accepted the arrangement. He was no romantic dreamer, but he understood her value, her lands, her wealth, and her royal bloodline. For Margaret, the marriage was less about companionship and more about survival. Through Stafford, Margaret learned the art of walking a razor's edge. He leaned toward the Yorkist cause, supporting Edward IV when he seized the throne.
Margaret, with Lancastrian blood running through her veins, might have been destroyed for such a connection, but instead she used it. Her marriage gave her a shield, a disguise of loyalty to the reigning Yorkist king, while in her heart she nurtured the survival of her son, the last fragile hope of Lancaster. Her estates were preserved, her position was tolerated, and most importantly, Henry Tudor was kept safe in the care of Jasper Tudor in Wales. Separated from her child, Margaret wrote letters, sent gifts, and prayed endlessly. Every night she lay awake fearing the knock at the door, the soldiers come to drag her boy to his death. But while she grieved her distance from Henry, Margaret adapted. She watched, she listened, she learned. She cultivated friendships with women at court, weaving a web of influence that stretched across both factions. With Yorkist queens, she spoke of loyalty. With Lancastrian exiles, she whispered of hope. She became a master of ambiguity, never declaring outright where her loyalties lay, but never abandoning her true cause either. The Wars of the Roses surged back and forth across the country. One year, Henry VI, feeble and broken, was restored to the throne. The next, Edward IV rode in triumph through London. Kings fell, crowns changed hands, nobles were executed one season and pardoned the next. Through it all, Margaret endured. Her marriage to Stafford, though never romantic, offered her stability for nearly 14 years. She learned to manage estates, to negotiate contracts, to balance the delicate politics of a divided kingdom. She grew shrewd, her mind sharpening with every passing crisis, and all the while she kept her son's claim alive in whispers, in secret prayers, in the hidden corners of her mind where hope could not be extinguished. For Margaret Beaufort, survival was not passive. It was an act of will. She bent when she had to, bowed when she must, but she never broke. Every compromise, every smile, every carefully chosen word was a step toward the same goal, the day her son would return and seize the crown. And so the child who had been forced into womanhood by blood and trauma became something else entirely, a strategist, a survivor, a player in the deadliest game England had ever known.
The year was 1471, and England was drowning in blood. The Wars of the Roses had reached their most brutal climax. At Tewkesbury, the Lancastrian cause was crushed. Edward, the young Prince of Wales, Henry VI's only son, was cut down in battle, some say murdered after capture. Soon after, Henry VI himself was dead in the Tower of London, his skull split, his reign ended with a whispered assassination. The Lancastrian line was finished. Or so it seemed. Because in Wales, there still lived a boy, Henry Tudor, Margaret Beaufort's only son, just 14 years old, thin, fragile, but alive. And with the extinction of Henry VI's heirs, his claims suddenly mattered more than ever. But being alive was dangerous. His blood made him the single greatest threat to the Yorkist king Edward IV. Margaret knew what that meant. If Henry stayed in England, he would not live long. And so Jasper Tudor, ever loyal, made a desperate decision. On a storm-lashed September night, Henry was hurried aboard a ship at Tenby, bound for exile in Brittany. The boy clutched the rail as waves crashed against the hull, carrying him away from everything he had ever known, his country, his lands, even his mother. He would not return for 14 long years. Margaret was not there to see him go. She only heard days later that her son had vanished across the sea, snatched away from her arms by necessity and fear. When the news reached her, it broke something inside her heart. She had spent Henry's whole childhood separated from him by distance, seeing him only rarely under the careful guardianship of Jasper. Now he was gone completely, carried into the uncertain refuge of a foreign land. The grief was unbearable. But grief did not crush her, it transformed her. If she could not be with her son in body, she would be with him in purpose. If she could not protect him with her hands, she would protect him with her mind.
The distance across the sea only hardened her will. Margaret Beaufort resolved that one day her child would return. One day he would claim the crown. From that moment forward, she became more than a grieving mother. She became a conspirator, a plotter, a mastermind. She began to build networks of information reaching into noble households, monasteries, merchant guilds, even the kitchens of castles. Servants carried whispers, priests carried messages in coded scripture, merchants smuggled letters across the channel. Margaret's correspondence with Henry became a secret lifeline, hidden in false names, invisible ink, and cleverly folded pages. She became obsessed with news from Brittany. Every rumor of sickness made her heart stop. Every whisper of betrayal filled her with dread. At any moment, Edward IV might send assassins across the sea to finish what Tewkesbury had begun. And yet Henry survived. Year after year, he survived. Margaret learned patience. She learned how to smile at Yorkist lords even as she plotted their downfall. She learned when to bend the knee, when to flatter, when to pretend loyalty. But beneath the surface, she was weaving a web that stretched wider and tighter with every passing year. The pain of separation never left her. Nights she lay awake staring into the dark, imagining her son's face, wondering if she would ever see him again. The thought that he might die in a foreign land without her, unburied, forgotten, gnawed at her soul. But she refused to let despair rule her. Instead, she transmuted grief into ambition. If Henry lived, he would return. And if he returned, he would be king. That became her prayer, her strategy, her obsession. By the late 1470s, Margaret Beaufort was no longer simply a noble widow. She was a force of politics in her own right, subtle, calculating, and utterly relentless. The young girl who had once been a pawn had become a player, and the game was only beginning.
By the early 1470s, Margaret Beaufort had already lived a dozen lives. She was a widow twice over, a child mother scarred for life, a strategist quietly weaving networks of survival, and through it all, she remained the mother of Henry Tudor, the last fragile thread of the Lancastrian cause. But survival alone would not be enough. Margaret needed power. She needed allies. She needed a position so strong that even kings would think twice before moving against her. The answer came in the form of a man known throughout England as one of the most cunning survivors of the Wars of the Roses, Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley. Stanley was no ordinary noble. He had mastered the art of politics like a seasoned gambler, always placing his bets at the last possible moment, always backing the winning side. He had served both Yorkists and Lancastrians, sometimes in the same breath. His armies were large, his wealth vast, and his influence stretched across the north of England. Most importantly, his family's forces could tip the scales in any battle. For Margaret, marriage to Stanley was not romance, it was war by other means. Their wedding in 1472 was a grand affair, far more elaborate than her quiet union with Henry Stafford. Nobles gathered, tournaments were held, feasts stretched long into the night. Even King Edward IV himself attended. Better to keep Margaret and her dangerous bloodline close, within sight, than let her drift into the shadows where conspiracies grew. The marriage was a partnership, and both sides knew it. Margaret brought her bloodline, a direct link to Edward III, the seed of dynastic legitimacy. Stanley brought soldiers, connections, and a reputation as a man too slippery to be trapped. Together they formed an alliance of convenience that would prove decisive in the fate of England. Margaret played her role to perfection. Outwardly, she was the dutiful wife of a loyal Yorkist lord. She smiled at court, entertained noble guests, and played the role of piety and obedience. But behind closed doors, she was relentless. She wrote coded letters to her exiled son. She smuggled funds across the channel. She used her new husband's position at court to gather intelligence, listening carefully to the gossip of ladies-in-waiting, the boasts of ambitious nobles, and the whispers of discontent that spread through the corridors of power. Stanley himself was no fool. He knew exactly who he had married. He may not have shared Margaret's devotion to Henry Tudor, but he understood the value of keeping options open. And Margaret, sharp,
persuasive and fiercely determined, gave him reason to consider the possibility that her son might one day wear the crown. Together they walked a knife's edge. Edward IV remained king, Richard of Gloucester lurked in the wings, and the Yorkist dynasty seemed secure, but Margaret saw beyond appearances. She knew the kingdom was brittle, its loyalties shifting like sand. She understood that one day the chance would come, and when it did, she and her son had to be ready. Her marriage to Thomas Stanley gave her cover. It gave her resources, and most importantly, it gave her the protection to continue her dangerous game of intrigue without being crushed. The girl who had once screamed in a birthing bed at 13 was now a woman of 30, hardened, intelligent, patient. She was no longer a pawn. With Stanley at her side, Margaret Beaufort had become a queenmaker in waiting. And across the sea, her son was growing into a man, preparing for the day she prayed would come.
In April 1483, fate turned the kingdom upside down once more. King Edward IV, still only 40 years old, died suddenly after years of excess. His death left the throne to his 12-year-old son, Edward V. For a brief moment, it seemed England might see a child king guided by loyal protectors. But in a kingdom poisoned by ambition, innocence never lasted long. The boy and his younger brother, Richard, were placed in the care of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. At first, it appeared Richard would serve as their protector. But within weeks, everything changed. The princes were taken to the Tower of London, supposedly for their safety. Soon after, whispers spread that they would never leave it alive. By July, Richard of Gloucester had declared his nephews illegitimate and crowned himself Richard III. The boys disappeared, their fate unrecorded, their voices silenced forever behind cold stone walls. The horror of their vanishing spread through England like wildfire. Mothers wept, nobles muttered in private, and even hardened soldiers recoiled. Richard had seized the throne, but the stain of blood clung to him. For Margaret Beaufort, this was the moment she had been waiting for. Richard's ruthless power grab shattered Yorkist legitimacy. For the first time in decades, the English people looked at the throne and saw not strength, but suspicion. Margaret understood immediately what this meant. Her son Henry, still exiled in Brittany, could now claim not just to be a Lancastrian heir, but the rightful savior of England. She began to plot with breathtaking audacity. Through secret letters and trusted allies, she reached out to Elizabeth Woodville, the widowed queen of Edward IV and mother of the missing princes. Together they struck a daring plan. Henry Tudor would marry Elizabeth's eldest daughter, uniting the Red Rose of Lancaster with the White Rose of York. In a single stroke, England's civil war could be ended, if Henry could seize the crown. The rebellion began in October 1483. Plans were made for Henry to land with an army while uprisings flared across England. But betrayal came swiftly. The plot was exposed, conspirators were executed, and Margaret herself was placed under house arrest by Richard III. Only her marriage to Thomas Stanley saved her from death. Yet even under guard, she continued to conspire. Letters slipped through kitchens and cloisters, her determination unbroken. 2 more years passed. Richard's reign grew darker, his enemies more restless. In exile, Henry Tudor bided his time, waiting for the moment to strike. That moment came in the summer of 1585. With French support, Henry sailed for England, landing at Milford Haven, the very shores where he had been born, in blood and agony 28 years before. His army was small, barely 5,000 men. Richard commanded nearly twice as many. But numbers alone do not win battles. Henry's faith lay in the one man who had always played both sides, Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband. The two armies met at Bosworth Field on August 22, 1585. The morning was heavy with mist, the ground soft with dew. Richard rode at the head of his men, armored in steel, the crown of England strapped to his helmet.
Henry, young and untested, rode at the center of his modest army, carrying not just weapons, but the weight of his mother's lifelong prayers. The battle raged for hours, a chaos of steel and screams. At last, Richard saw his chance. With ferocious courage, he led a cavalry charge straight at Henry himself, determined to end the fight with a single blow. He cut down Henry's standard-bearer and nearly reached the young pretender. But at that moment, the decision came. Thomas Stanley, who had held back his troops, watching from the hills, chose his side. His forces thundered down the slopes, not to save Richard, but to destroy him. Betrayed, Richard fought like a lion, refusing to flee, striking blows even as he was surrounded. But courage could not save him. He was cut down in the mud, screaming defiance until the last. When the battle ended, Richard III's body lay stripped and bloodied, his crown plucked from the mire and set upon Henry Tudor's head. The boy born in agony at Pembroke Castle had become Henry VII, King of England. And in the shadows of victory stood Margaret Beaufort. She had waited decades, suffered beyond imagining, sacrificed everything, her childhood, her body, her peace, for this moment. Now her son was king. But even in triumph, there was no joy. There was only purpose. The Wars of the Roses were over. A new dynasty had begun, and it had been forged by the iron will of a woman who refused to surrender.
Margaret Beaufort lived to see what few mothers in history have ever witnessed, the triumph of a dynasty born from her own suffering. Her son, Henry VII, crowned in blood at Bosworth, did not merely seize a throne, he secured it. He married Elizabeth of York, uniting the Red Rose of Lancaster with the White Rose of York, ending decades of civil war. Together they founded the Tudor dynasty, a line that would reshake England, give birth to giants like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and change the course of the world. But behind the grandeur of the dynasty was the shadow of Margaret's life. She had given everything, her body, her youth, her peace of mind, to see her son crowned. She never bore another child after Henry, the scars of her first labor sealing her womb forever. She lived with pain, with memories of screams in the night, with the trauma of a childhood stolen. As Henry ruled, Margaret was no silent spectator. She remained at his side, his most trusted advisor, his counselor, his guardian spirit. Courtiers whispered that the king himself feared her sharp mind and unyielding will. She signed letters as Margaret R., adopting the queenly style of regality, though she was never crowned. Some called her the king's mother, others the true power behind the throne. But for all her influence, she never again knew the simple joys of motherhood. The boy she had nearly died to bring into the world was now a king, distant, burdened by rule, claimed by a nation. Their bond was political as much as it was personal, a relationship forged in destiny rather than tenderness. In 1509, at the age of 66, Margaret Beaufort finally lay on her deathbed. England mourned, but she herself seemed at peace. She had lived long enough to see her grandson, Henry VIII, crowned king, securing the dynasty she had carved out of blood and will. She had finished her work. Her tomb lies in Westminster Abbey, a place of kings and queens, carved from black marble, her figure immortalized in prayer. Visitors read the Latin inscription praising her piety and strength, but the stone cannot tell the full story. It cannot capture the sound of that first scream in the winter of 1457, when a 13-year-old girl lay dying as her son was born. It cannot describe the nights of solitude, the years of exile, the endless plotting, the sacrifices unseen. The Tudors would be remembered for power, glory, and excess, but at their root stood a child forced into womanhood, a mother whose love was sharper than politics, and whose suffering was greater than any crown. Margaret Beaufort was not just a survivor, she was the architect of an empire.
Her life was the proof that dynasties are not built by kings alone, but by the hidden endurance of women who paid the price in blood. And if you stand in Pembroke Castle today, where the sea winds still claw at the stone, and listen closely on a winter's night, some say you can still hear it. The echo of her scream, the scream that brought forth the Tudor dynasty, the scream that changed England forever.